Should we turn these on? Okay. Can you hear me?
No.
No. Is it on? No. Okay. No, it doesn't have. They need to turn it on. It's two different systems. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Great. Okay.
You're gonna unmute.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We're gonna get started. There's a lot of tech going on. Taken from posterity. There's also the live stream that's hopefully working. We normally don't do introductions with the Coordination Center. That's one of my policies. But Amisha asked me to do introductions because of the live stream. So I'm going to do very brief ones of everyone on the panel for the benefit of everyone in the live stream and then for the recording for later. I know that things are looking. I'm going to mangle any of your bios, but this is just the 2-sentence bios. We can build on them later. Deborah Amos is Ferris Professor of Journalism in residence at Princeton University. She's also a former longtime Middle East and international correspondent at NPR. Many of you are familiar with her reports over the years. Omar Dawashi is an associate professor of medical anthropology and global health at Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey. His work examines the social, medical, and environmental fallouts of decades of war and violence in Iraq and in the broader Middle East. Mona Shalabi is an award-winning writer and illustrator. She's currently the data editor at The Guardian. Her work earned her a Pulitzer Prize in illustrative reporting and commentary last year for work that she did for the New York Times. The Pulitzer Board cited her striking illustrations that combine statistical reporting with keen analysis to help readers understand the immense wealth and economic power of Amazon founder Jeff Bezos. Finally, Abdullah Fayyad is a former opinion writer and editorial board member at the Boston Globe. He is about to start a new position at Fox Media. We added that to your bio. In 2022, he was named the Pulitzer Prize finalist for editorial writing for a series of editorials he wrote on reforming the American presidency. And I'm Mohammed Bazi, I'm the director of the Coordination Center. Okay, yeah, that was that business. I wanted to start today talking about Iraq and wanted to move this sequence to the present day. But then I saw this tweet. You can read next slide, please. A few hours ago, and I thought we really needed to start in Gaza. Ah, here we go. Okay. I hope you can all see it through the speakers. This is Danny Ganon, who is a current member of the Knesset. He's a leading official at the Israeli Likud, and he's Israel's former ambassador to the UN. Here, I'll read it for you in case you can't see it in the back. Israel's Internal Security Agency announced that they will eliminate all participants of the October 7th massacre. The quote, air quotes, photojournalists who took part in recording the assault will be added to that list. Just a little bit of context on this. An organization that calls itself Honest Reporting accused a number of Palestinian journalists, mostly freelance journalists and photographers, of having had advanced knowledge of the Hamas attacks on October 7th and of having accompanied Hamas during the attacks or some of the attacks on that day. So these vague allegations have been repeated in the Israeli media over the past week or so, especially in the Hebrew language media. And of course, I guess everyone here knows, we've seen an unprecedented number of journalists killed in this conflict, overwhelmingly by Israeli bombing. So as of today, the Committee to Protect Journalists, CPJ, has documented at least 39 journalists killed, journalists and media workers, 34 Palestinians, 4 Israelis, and 9 Lebanese. So with this tweet, the danger is fairly obvious, at least this is my own opinion of it, not Amisha's, not anyone else necessarily on the panel, but it's one of the things I want us to start off with. So in real time, we can see Israeli politicians and top officials essentially floating a rationale for the extrajudicial killings of journalists and their families in Gaza, as we've seen in the last 4 weeks. So I'm going to start with a broad question about this, and there were some other variations on this tweet by other Israeli officials today as well. What do we make of this? Not everyone is a journalist, Omar, but Omar will have some thoughts on it as well. And what are the responsibilities of journalistic institutions, of journalistic watchdogs in seeing this unfold, and almost anyone who's watching and consuming media? This is a question to everyone in all. Who wants to start for now?
Sure. I don't know if my microphone's on. I think it should be on. Yeah? Okay, great. I can just...
Can you hear her in the back?
No.
No.
I can just try and talk really loudly. It's on.
Okay.
It's not muted. No. I don't know. Maybe it's just
Maybe she can use yours.
Okay.
Do you want to use this one?
Oh, yeah. Okay. Sorry, everyone. We were just shown that it doesn't make a difference, does it? Me holding it here. Okay. Sorry. Yeah, we were showing this just before we came up, and I'll be really honest. My immediate thought was great, sincerely, because a lot of people in this room know that this is already the policy. It just was never stated so flagrantly before. And actually, there's a relief in witnessing the rendering of explicit of what has often been done in slightly more, I wouldn't even say discreet ways. It just hasn't been on Twitter with quite the same clarity. So I appreciate it. I hope that all of this stuff ends up at the ICC at some point. I don't know how optimistic I feel about that. There are two things that strike me as interesting about this. One is obviously the use of quote marks, and it just makes me really, really wonder, what is the definition of a journalist, especially now? Is it just anyone who has a phone, who is documenting violence? And then the other part of it that I had briefly mentioned to the other panelists, I think is really interesting, is that specifically they're calling out photojournalists, right? There's a certain power in the photography and the footage that we're all witnessing. And I was speaking to a colleague at the New York Times who was reporting on Ukraine and just received a very, very prestigious prize for their phenomenal reporting on Ukraine. And I said to them, how does it feel to be getting this kind of recognition for your reporting on Ukraine when you know that the New York Times has done, I would say actually dangerous reporting when it comes to Palestine. And she said this thing that I just thought was so interesting. She was like, the journalists who are writing about Ukraine and Gaza, the journalists who have been in both places, don't necessarily see the parallels, but the photojournalists do. She was like, every photojournalist who has served in both places, served is also a strange use of language, but anyway, who has worked in both places, fully can see the parallels in these two conflicts. And I think that's really interesting. And that to me speaks to the danger of those images, if someone using images can kind of see those connections. Sorry, those were my initial thoughts, yeah.
Yeah.
I will, yeah, sure. I don't know, let's see, does it?
Yeah.
So, there's not been a more dangerous time for journalists, and especially those who are working in Gaza, because...
Not in the back, sorry.
Oh, can you move it to the other lapel? We tried that. I think these mics aren't powerful enough to pick us up no matter where we put them, but we'll try.
Okay. Even when I'm holding it here, it's not really doing anything. I don't think it's gonna, yeah.
I don't think it's on. Can you hear that? No, I've got it on. And the battery's low, yeah. So let's do this at the moment. So the Lebanese journalist who was killed, there have been, what?
Your lapel is on, so.
Oh, great. Okay, much better. So at least that one was recognized as a targeted hit.
Reporters Without Borders.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So that's what we have.
Yeah.
That's who reports on what happens to journalists. So that's on the record. There was another Israeli official who called for an atomic bomb in Gaza. Let us hope that not all of these things that are said on Twitter come to pass. And I've not seen anybody refute this in the Israeli, hierarchy. So what to say? It's dangerous. We know it's dangerous. It's really hard to deny what this means. And they have the ability to target people. So we will know. We will know soon enough if that really is the policy.
What I would add to this and echo just what Mona was saying as well. I think it's important when you look at this tweet to know that this isn't a singular event in Israeli history when it comes to targeting journalists, that actually there's a long history, particularly with photojournalists, of Israelis targeting them and discrediting their work. A lot of, they have this quote unquote Pallywood idea of like videos that Palestinians had recorded of police brutality, military brutality against Palestinians actually not being real, that it's fabricated. So, if you want to understand a lot of how Republicans lie in America and about how Trump's big lie about the election actually spread, a good place to start is actually seeing how the Israeli government and Israeli propaganda has undermined Palestinian narratives from actually saying that what you're seeing in front of your eyes is actually not happening. So there's a long history of this tweet, and this tweet I also don't think is that singular, and I don't think it's the first time actually that Israel has articulated this kind of policy. When Shireen Abu Akleh was killed last year, one of the first responses from an Israeli military spokesperson was, he said, quote unquote, "If I may, they were armed with cameras." So Israel has always viewed cameras and journalists. Who would say a camera is a weapon unless you have something to hide? So this is just one more, a more extreme version of what Israel has long done to us Palestinians, to undermine Palestinian journalists, our voices, anybody who writes something from a Palestinian perspective or something that's critical of Israel, to say that actually what you're seeing is not real. This is extremely dangerous right now because this has been, according to the Committee to Protect Journalists, the deadliest conflict for journalists since they started recording these statistics in 1992. 10 of the journalists in Gaza out of the 35 Palestinian journalists who have been killed by airstrikes were killed while doing their job. And I think it's safe to assume that they weren't just killed while in the line of duty, but they were also killed for doing their job, as was evident by the Lebanese journalist who was killed. And Reporters Without Borders found that Israel had actually targeted and killed them. A lot of reports of Shireen Abu Akleh's murder as well found that she was, and the people around her, witnesses around her, who were press, clearly wearing press labels, were targeted by the Israeli military. It wasn't an accidental firing of a fatal bullet. There wasn't crossfire between militants and the IDF at the time. So I think this is just especially dangerous because it's not just about journalists right now either. You had the president of Israel essentially undermine the idea that there are innocent civilians in Gaza. This is just along those lines. That's to justify the murder, the slaughter of innocent people and journalists, that actually there's no such thing as an innocent Palestinian, be they a civilian, be they man, woman, or child, or be they a journalist documenting the atrocities that are happening in Gaza. It is just to undermine our innocence as a people and to justify our murder, our slaughter. And now over 10,000 people have been killed. And this is all just to say that actually that's all fair, because we're all guilty of supporting what happened on October 7th, and we're all just guilty of being Palestinian. Being Palestinian virtually in the eyes of the Israeli military and the Israeli state, as is evident here, is a crime. And that's what they're persecuting us for.
Sorry, I just wanted to add one follow-up point to that, which I think is so important. In addition to all of those names that are displayed up there of all of the journalists who have been killed, that doesn't even include people like Wael, who work for Al Jazeera, whose family members have been targeted. Imagine trying to go out and continue to do your job after your partner and your children have been murdered. I don't understand how you're supposed to pick up a microphone the next day, pick up a camera, which he did. But that shouldn't be held up as we shouldn't be normalized or desensitized to the idea of going back to work after that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know if I can add this. These are really, I think, excellent points. I think one thing I can kind of say here is that there has been a long history of how these wars, the kind of the idea of the war on terror, visualized. And I think I remember the earlier moments of the Iraq War in 2003 when there were all these Western embedded journalists covering the war. They, of course, they appear with the military. They say, oh, we cannot tell you a lot of details. We have to protect the military, but they're supposedly reporting on the war. And at that time in Iraq, even there were no cell phones, there was no internet. So the kind of what happens in the decades afterwards is the proliferation of this ability to visualize violence in a very, very close way. And if people remember that kind of cliche from that war when the Iraqi information minister comes out on TV and says, well, there's nothing here, and then behind him there is an American tank. That was really like you can read it like these kind of Fox News commentators who are like, things are very clear visually in front of you, but you can really deny it to create thinking that the collective will not really see that. And I think what you begin to see over these decades, especially with the war on terror, is a kind of a split. What you see, like right now, if I follow the news, I open on the Mayadeen, watch something. There's a completely different narrative, completely different images. On Al Jazeera, you open it; it's a very different narrative than the Mayadeen. You open on CNN, or you open it on Al Jazeera English, is even different than Jazeera Arabic. There is this way now that the image has become so powerful in constructing narrative or denying it.
So can I just say, I mean, this war, I've never seen anything like this war, ever. And the amount of social media, and I've seen a lot of wars. This one is different in terms of how much social media is playing a huge role and how much disinformation is too. That is an expression of complete frustration in not being able to control the narrative. Israel has been very good at controlling the narrative. This time it is out of their hands, and there's not much they can do about it. We are all looking at close-ups of Gaza. To your point about the photographers in Ukraine, who, if you see it, it's different. If you photograph it, it's different. And there's no way to stop it. You can target as many journalists as you want, but it's kind of like there's another one right behind them with a camera or a notebook. And I don't think they know what to do.
I'm glad you brought up 2003 because we can.
You just lost your mic.
Can you hear me on this one?
No.
Okay. No, it doesn't. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
There you go.
Maybe let's just pass this one around.
Okay.
You can all, yeah.
Mine works.
You can shut up yours. Okay.
Mine works. I'm too far away for the cord.
Okay, sorry. Okay.
Okay. Okay, 2003. And speaking of threats, I don't know how many of you remember George W. Bush told journalists ahead of the invasion that anyone who stayed behind in Baghdad, you could not guarantee their safety. A very, very straight threat to, including news organizations that were, had pretty much, let's say, bought most of the administration's rationale for going to war, including those news organizations that had journalists in Baghdad at that point. And he basically said they wanted the journalists to get out, and there weren't the cell phones in Iraq was particularly, we didn't have the social media that we had today, but there was, you pretty much, if you got the journalists out in Baghdad, you basically got most way of telling the world. And that didn't happen. A lot of news organizations stayed. And one impact of that, speaking of Al Jazeera, was Tariq Ayoub, Al Jazeera journalist. Al Jazeera had provided the location of their bureau to the US military. The US still bombed that bureau and killed Tariq Ayoub. Also later on, I think the next day, 2 journalists were killed in the Sheraton. I mean, this is not targeting, we haven't seen anything of this scale, as Deborah points out, but targeting of journalists during wartime and conflict, essentially to achieve a purpose to silence as much of it as possible isn't new. We've seen it before. We saw it in 2003. We saw it before that. But and it seems, if we just go back to 2003 for a little bit, that U.S. never really, there was an uproar, but U.S. never, and the Bush administration didn't pay a price for that. And I mean, are we seeing something similar here where Israel isn't? I mean, so there's nothing restraining. I mean, now it's much more public. Bush didn't say we're going to bomb you if you stay, but he did say we're not going to be able to guarantee your safety.
Well, I mean, I think this could be kind of put in a broader term around accountability of war. And I think in a place like Iraq, in many ways, accountability goes there to die in many ways. I mean, the entire war, how it was built, the narrative about it, the crimes that were committed, there were definitely some kind of compensation projects and happening within Iraq at that time, but that war ended up in a very kind of it just disappeared, and the world moved somewhere else. So I think in a place like Iraq also, at least from the Western media, they had also hired a lot of locals to do that kind of on the ground daily work. So I think there's a kind of a history of who are the journalists that have been killed. Iraq was considered as one of the dangerous places for journalists. Many journalists died over these 20 years, not just one or two, not just this kind of moment of the invasion, but over the time, many journalists died in different kinds of ways. And I don't know if the accountability is just about journalism, but this opens up this Pandora's box about what kind of wars go kind of examined, be it through international law or through other kind of means. I find this to be a very troubling fact, and many of us, at least in my work, I'm kind of a little bit attached to these events to look at the long-term consequences of them, partly because the attention moves away as soon as the military moves on.
Yeah, sorry.
That's okay.
One thing so I don't want to overemphasize the parallels between the two, because I think there's way more differences than there are parallels actually between what happened in Iraq, what is happening still in Iraq, like it's not done, and what's happening right now in Gaza. And a weird thing that occurred to me when you were talking earlier about like this minister and the tank in the background, this is going to be a really fucked up thing to say, but it was fucked up. It felt like there was a lot of humor in the Iraq war. Right. People would regularly laugh at George Bush saying like weird expressions on TV. I remember I was a teenager at the time, and I remember watching the press conference with Muntadhar al-Zaidi, the Iraqi who threw his shoes at Bush, and it was considered funny. And at the time, I remember feeling so much internalized racism, so much shame of like, why do my people throw shoes, And now I'm just like,
it was great.
It was so, also very few press outlets reported on what it was that he said when he threw the shoes. He said, "This is from the orphans of Iraq, you dog." Like, that is a powerful thing to do. There's a reason why the Iraqi security forces that were there immediately destroyed his shoes before they could end up in like a museum somewhere. Like, how does shoes pose a risk? Yeah.
Although that moment has a life every year on social media.
I know, but there's still humor. There's still humor in that meme. And actually, none of it was fucking funny. None of it was funny.
Right.
And I do actually find something reassuring. I haven't heard anyone, like in my circles, I'm sure in other circles, people are finding humor somehow. I haven't laughed at any aspect of this. I don't know. There's something different happening now, and there's good to it and there's bad. I don't know.
But no humor.
No,
I just want to add a detail about Iraq. Considering how bad the reporting was before the war, I think American journalism redeemed itself, as the war progressed. I mean, the reporting got a whole lot better as people hit the ground. And that is kind of what had been missing before. So nobody could refute all the crap that was coming out of Washington about WMD and all the weapons that Saddam had. So there is a moment, and through that war, I think American journalism did a pretty good job.
I mean, as the years went on.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm glad you brought that up because that is one of the things that's been on my mind since October 7th and many of our minds of the lessons we did think that at least the media and let's say political leadership of this country learned some pretty transparent lessons after the Iraq invasion and after 9/11 of the rush to war, the rush to vengeance, the extreme toll on civilians, and rushing into a war without any plan. I mean, even if we were to put aside the humanitarian aspect and the moral aspect of the war in Gaza, what Israel is doing in Gaza right now, you put that aside, as hard it is to do. And even if you go with a pragmatic interpretation and say, okay, this is about geopolitical interests, this is realpolitik, and especially in a U.S. perspective, when you go down that road, none of what the Biden administration makes a lot of sense in a pragmatic way either, because it's actually perpetuating the cycle of what had happened. It's basically repeating all the mistakes in the lead up to Iraq and what was learned or what was presumably learned right after Iraq or in the years after Iraq. So I've been stunned at how quickly so many institutions, media, politics, elsewhere, unlearned those lessons that were really hard fought, Deb, as you know. It took years to get, I'm sure you struggled and others in the room here who covered 2003 and its aftermath. I think we all struggled in different ways to convey the reality on the ground. It took a couple of years. I remember it taking a couple of years for it to become accepted wisdom that this war was really badly planned and badly executed, just on that level, and didn't help U.S. interests. So how do we unlearn those lessons? Now, journalistically, how are the lessons unlearned so quickly?
But who's the we? Like, I think, as people who have worked in newsrooms, when you're the Arab in the newsroom, you're not part of that we. Like, I was very aware of the idea that going into Iraq was not a fucking good idea. And I think that it is a particularly terrifying time to be a journalist right now who is Arab or even who is Muslim right now. I think hopefully there is going to be a redefining of what constitutes bias and what constitutes objective reporting, right? So I don't get a choice of supposed neutrality because you take one look at me, you know my last name, you're going to know where I stand on Palestine. Like, unless I've literally had like a section of my brain removed, it's very, very clear where I stand. Other journalists are able to do this dance and are supposedly neutral, but based on what? Like, we're not asking the same questions as some of these journalists. Is it not legitimate to ask when you're reading some coverage from the New York Times whether or not that journalist did birthright? That's you can't ask that. You got a funded trip from the Israeli government to go and see the country as a teenager, but you can be a neutral reporter on this. I think like the we really has to be analyzed of like which voices are in the room. I don't know. I don't even know what I'm saying except that like it's a hard time to be a journalist.
I'm going to be speaking this royalty of journalism in general, but my question is, how did the institutions unlearn lessons?
They haven't unlearned them.
Yeah, I would just add to this. Sorry,
with whether they learned them at all.
I don't think. I think this is completely right because I think there are aspects of our media industry, and it's important for this room, since this room is mostly journalists, to know, especially here in U.S. media, that the lessons of Iraq and how we reported on it and how we took government statements at face value with little skepticism and kind of, foamed at the mouth and had some like bloodlust, especially in our opinion sections over, invading Iraq. We didn't learn those lessons because we've seen them happen time and again at any time there's a war, and we saw them again now. But the real danger in how American newsrooms respond, if I could just finish on this, because we were talking about this tweet earlier, and I think that it's important to not just talk about how the politicians in Israel talk about journalists and Arab journalists, or how American politicians talk about our reporting, but it's also important to talk about how our newsrooms have undermined Arab and Palestinian and even Muslim, non-Arab Muslim journalists that allow this kind of rhetoric to actually have traction. That's the real damning aspect of American media. And that's what was so frustrating being an Arab in American media, is seeing how our newsrooms respond to our journalism and undermine us as Palestinian journalists. And I'm just going to add on this because it's really important. We see this time and again. When Shireen Abu Akleh was murdered, she wasn't the only journalist on the scene. She was surrounded by her colleagues who were also Arab journalists, many of them Palestinians. And when Israel lied and said that Palestinian fighters had actually fired the fatal bullet, a lot of our newsrooms ran with that statement without including qualifications that the Palestinian journalists on the scene denied, not only denied, but said that there was no crossfire. They saw where the bullet came from. And in any other circumstance, we as American newsrooms tend to take journalists' words at face value before we do powerful institutions. And so when we do this, we undermine our own journalists and our colleagues on the ground over there. And then statements like this actually have power to cause harm, cause violence, and eventually kill us. One positive element of what happened today, and one thing that actually I thought was heartening, was when the quote-unquote honest reporting, the organization that spews a lot of pro-Israeli propaganda like CAMERA, the Center for Accurate Reporting in the Middle East, or whatever it's called, is the New York Times defended one of its reporters in an official statement, and it defended him and said that, the accusation that, he knew had prior knowledge of the attacks and all that, and it stood by him. And we have to see more. So, kudos to the New York Times for doing this and standing up for their journalists this time. And I hope that we see more and more of this happen to immediately undermine these kinds of statements before they actually, cause harm.
So here's the thing. I covered the end of Gaza in 2021. I was vacation relief. Our guy was exhausted. I was there at the end of the war and right in the beginning of the elections. It was amazing to watch the coverage. The New York Times, if you remember, had a full page, front page of all the kids who had died in Gaza. I can't imagine them doing that now. And so what I don't understand is how did we get from there to here, right? I was there with the New York Times, and they said, boy, if things changed in the newsroom, we have many more Arab journalists, Palestinian journalists, Muslim, and they talk on Slack. And so our coverage is changing. And now we're at this conflict, and it is criminalized to be pro-Palestinian. I don't think that's an accident. I think that's part of that. The idea that you need to make, that there's a price to pay now for publicly being pro-Palestinian, because it's now assumed that means, or this is how it's portrayed, that you are pro-Hamas, whether you are or not. But I mean, the difference between 2021 and now, for me, is striking. And I'm not altogether sure how that happened.
Thank you for, that's part of what I was trying to get at in Iraq. And I'm sorry, maybe there's a generational difference between us. You guys are a little younger than us in that. But I'm also thinking of the trajectory. I mean, I partly teach this in one of my undergrad classes. There is when you go to see there was a moment a few years in, Bill Moyers did a PBS special 4 years in on the mistakes that led up to the war. And there was a recognition of media mistakes, malfeasance, sort of whatever you want to call it, a few years in, that basically also said the war is unwinnable. There's a little bit of parallels to the Vietnam trajectory there. But there was a reckoning and we can argue about whether it really made a huge impact, but there was a shift a few years in, and there's a fairly wide acceptance publicly now that the Iraq war was a mistake in the US. In 2002, you went anywhere, you had, I remember on broadcast, Phil Donahue was the sole voice. MSNBC was totally pro-war. But I think Deb's point is important. She expressed it better than I did. There was some progress. There was progress in the letter that was issued in 2021 of journalists about coverage of Gaza. But and maybe the answer is partly that it was so tenuous that maybe that was a mirage.
But but do you think it's like learning something, or is it just the attention span just was over? Because, if you remember, this was also a period where when Obama came, the kind of the policy of the government was now to say, well, that wasn't really the war we kind of wanted to go into, and let's pull out from Iraq. And then so you get definitely a media discourse that follows that certain kind of party line in many ways. The really fascinating thing is, like, I grew up in Baghdad. I grew up in Iraq under Saddam. I grew up with this kind of sense of censorship that is so strong in the media, where anyone you even kind of interview in the street will have to like kind of sing all the jingles for Saddam, regardless of what you do, and it's incredibly kind of interesting to see how news presenters or journalists kind of self-censor themselves when they talk about this ongoing conflict. And the way that you have to say certain things in a certain way, the way you have to like bring in certain words with describing the attack, or for example, it's fascinating because there is this kind of psychology of censorship that is so prevalent right now, and now it's actually even so powerful that if you say something that is not really in line, you lose your job, you could get kicked out, you get trolled. There's so much incredible violence around censorship and self-censorship.
Can I just sorry?
No, go ahead. No.
I just want
All get
I just wanted to push back a little bit on this as well. Again, just for clarity here, I think oftentimes our media institutions, us as journalists, learn our mistakes after the fact, and oftentimes in mainstream media, we do this when it's too late. So it's not just about covering the Arab world and covering Palestine and covering the Israeli occupation or the Iraq War. But time and again, our newsrooms get things wrong when it comes to covering minority communities or marginalized communities, people who are struggling. So we learned the lessons, for example, when we finally covered the opioid epidemic here in the United States that was largely afflicting white communities in rural America, and covered it with more compassion than, say, we covered the crack epidemic in the 1980s, which afflicted mostly Black America and urban areas. And we had this reckoning in newsrooms that said, why did we cover the crack epidemic in the way that we did, that dehumanized people who are addicted to drugs in a way that we did not of the opioid epidemic? And we supposedly learned that lesson. And then fast forward a couple years, and then a white guy, former Marine, I believe, murdered a guy in broad daylight on the New York subway. A Black guy who I believe was homeless. I might have this story wrong. Because people on the subway were uncomfortable around him. I don't know exactly the details right now off the top of my head. But this guy, white guy, murdered him in front of people, and our newsrooms, including our opinion sections, justified the murder as people have had enough of homelessness. People have had enough of seeing, quote unquote, vagrants on the streets harassing them. And that in a way, this was justifying what was done. So I think we just are in this never ending, time is a flat circle. I think we learn our lessons, unlearn them, learn our lessons, unlearn them. And I think that's what we're seeing happen now, because it's really not just about the Arab world. It's really how American media institutions, American journalists in mainstream outlets have covered marginalized communities.
And you can literally see it in, exactly as you described, the murder of Shireen and the way that her colleagues were treated. The exact same thing happened when Issam was murdered. His colleagues were not allowed to speak about what they had seen. They were not considered credible witnesses. Literally the exact same thing happened. And then I just wanted to follow up on this idea of self-censorship and just reiterate, it's absolutely true. A lot of self-censorship, like there are things I'm saying. I would have never said the birthright comment that I said tonight, like a few years ago. That was self-censorship. That felt like it was off the table. I'm going to say it now. I think there's self-censorship, but there is also actual censorship. So since October 7th, I have received one commission. I'm quite a good journalist. I normally get quite a few commissions. I have received one commission. It's from the art desk at the New York Times. And they reached out and they were like, we'd love to have you create some art on the conflict. I'm very aware that this is being live streamed. I'm okay, I'm just going to tell the story. Burning bridges everywhere, it's fine. And I was like, okay, let's get on the phone, because I just want to have a phone call. And this editor was like, listen, I'm with you. I fully understand. The problem is that most of our artwork has been to be frank, quite pro-Israel, and we'd like to have something else. Okay. I feel uncomfortable with that because I'm not Palestinian, right? And if you're going to have one fucking voice in the room, I would prefer for it to be a Palestinian rather than these Arabs that have suddenly, we've all become these pseudo spokespeople for Palestinians. I'm not totally comfortable with that. But okay, I'm going to request that you have a Palestinian and me. I'm going to be greedy. And I pitched them a bunch of ideas, one of which I pitched them about military aid, because I do data journalism, right? So most of my work is grounded in research. So I pitched them artwork which was depicting military aid to Israel, and I pitched them an article which was looking at the New York Times bias in covering Israeli and Palestinian deaths. They passed politely, and I ended up publishing it myself. But I want to come to the censorship, right? They said no to those ideas. What the editor came back with was, we would love to have a beautiful piece of artwork from you on what it feels like right now as an Arab woman to be watching this. And I was like, no, I am a journalist. My views are based on facts, not feelings. And you have seen Arab journalists being marginalized into the opinion pages, that our views on this conflict are opinion. So you get a bit more latitude if you can speak on opinion. For sure, I can speak a bit more frankly, but it's opinion, it's not fact. And what the New York Times is doing right now is not factual. There are factual errors in their reporting. It is factually misleading to write an article describing the displacement of Gazans as migration. That is a factual lie to your readers. And that's what I'm like. Anyway, so I think I'm also saying this to all of the fellow journalists in the room. You will be asked to do op-eds in the weeks and months and years to come, and that is important. But your work is better than that. It's more than simply opinion. And I think we have to fight against that.
Just to be clear, this is the desk that you want a Pulitzer Prize for.
No, it was a different desk.
Okay,
It was a different
but it's
desk.
the publication you want a Pulitzer Prize for. You can't do much better than that for them. But this is
I also entered the work myself because I knew they weren't going to enter me. So that's how I got it. But yeah,
Good for you.
And lied on the application that the editor had approved the work to be part of their submission package when it wasn't. Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit about self-censorship as well. So, look, it's a small sample, but I have students in a classroom, and my sense from them, although I can't really tell, but my sense from them is that they've picked a team. They're all pro-Palestinian. They are. They're quiet about it because they're scared. Because
Okay.
they know what happened at Harvard, but they don't understand what happened at Harvard. And that's the problem. So there's a lot of people with strong opinions without a whole lot of context. We could have used all of this as a teaching moment. That would have been great for Harvard. Why are some people offended by what you said? That would have been a fine response to what happened in Harvard, but that's not what happened. Those kids all got doxxed, and their pictures are everywhere. And so my students see that, and they clam up because they're scared. They don't know what any of this means, and it seems arbitrary about what happens to you if you express an opinion that somebody doesn't like. So I see it in this generation, yet I'm pretty sure that this generation is, I think the Israelis have lost this generation in what I can see where I am.
Well, I mean, I think that the interesting fact here is that, like, I've been here in this country for a long time, and I was here when 9/11 happened and during the Iraq War, and at that time I never felt the censorship, and I agree, it's not just self-censorship, and that's what my point is that there is something really, it's like that Iraqi minister who's like, there's nothing here, and then the tanks are in the background, so it's like, how can you? That's the line of the party that you have to deliver. It was much easier to criticize the U.S. at that time. You can kind of be somewhere. It's like, oh, George Bush is a criminal. This whole institution is killing Iraqis. It's easier to say that, and this is what I find is very fascinating in the U.S. is that, but lo and behold, you say something about Israel. It's a completely different ballgame. So it's one of the weirdest kind of places where you can actually criticize the country, which is the political system here, but you cannot criticize the political system somewhere else.
No, go.
Please.
Just, I agree with all of that. I do find it quite, I'm encouraged by the way that some of our language is shifting. I've heard the word Zionism more in the past month than I have years living in this city.
Yeah.
Thank God people are starting to understand what the fuck that word means. That's important. That's really important. That's going to change things.
To your point, Ahmad, I was just going to say, I think Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper, has taken as an editorial board far bolder stances than any editorial board.
Absolutely.
I think one thing that I find incredibly damning of our industry in this moment, and really disheartening as a journalist in this industry, is kind of looking at the parallels between, the one thing that journalists can stand up for is other journalists and the free press, and this is like the one political stand we as newsrooms often feel comfortable taking. Stand up for the free press, stand up for journalists doing their jobs. And rightly so, when the Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich, sorry if I mispronounced his name, was wrongfully detained by Russia, there was good and righteous outrage here in the United States to get our colleague in this industry back home because we believe he's wrongfully detained for doing his job. And that was the right call for our newsroom to make. There were social media campaigns, newspapers across the country, not just opinion sections and editorial boards, but newspapers, the newsrooms, did those photo shoots with Free Evan signs. We had hashtag Free Evan. People changed their profile pictures. And that was an okay political stand to take because it's the right stand to take as journalists to stand up for our colleagues, whether they're in this industry in the United States or any industry, any other country around the world. Now that this has been the deadliest conflict for journalists, according to the Committee to Protect Journalists since 1992, the fact, as far as I know, to this day, not a single editorial board in this country has condemned Israel's assault on the free press, even after Reporters Without Borders report came out showing that they actually targeted and killed Lebanese journalists in southern Lebanon as well. That to me is incredibly alarming, because at what point will we stand up for these journalists? And this again is what makes that statement that we saw earlier have more water.
Can I just add to that really, really quickly? Sorry.
Yes.
Just because you've mentioned the Pulitzers. The ceremony was 2 weeks ago. Again, going to overshare in ways that are probably inappropriate. Many journalists were wearing the Free Evan pin, right? Really, really important, fantastic. I arrived. I was the last person there because I was doing this article on how the New York Times is so biased before sitting down at the dinner with an editor from the New York Times. And they gave a speech before handing out the awards. And in the speech, they talked about, the guy said, I don't even know who this dude was, some elderly white man who runs the Pulitzers. He said that, I was at my desk on October 7th and I started to see news alerts on my phone that had the Israeli flag and they were saying war in Israel over and over again. And as we watched this war unfold, the Israel-Gaza conflict unfold, verification has never become more important. The thing that was so striking to me about that night, they couldn't not mention it, right? No one would say the word Palestine. Literally, they came up to me afterwards because I said, why is nobody saying the word Palestine? And he said to me, it doesn't even make sense what he said. He said, the reason why we framed it that way is because not everyone supports Hamas over there. He wouldn't even verbally say in a one-on-one conversation with me. So yeah, I don't know why I'm saying all of this, except saying that is a rumor, supposedly the creme de la creme. I mean, I'm one and done. I'm never going to get invited back there. It's fine. Of journalism, and they won't even acknowledge that Palestine exists. Well, if you can't say it.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I know you have probably a lot of questions. So
I do. I'll let you.
But sorry, just a
follow-up.
Okay.
Okay. Well, I mean, I'm going to ask you, because this is a point you made earlier that I think is important and we should get at it. It's connected to Mona's point as well. Bill, you made this point about refusing to believe Palestinians as sources, whether you're talking about the death toll that gets questioned, including by Biden, and the Gaza Health Ministry issued the actual list of names. We have not seen, we've seen a list of names from Israel, actually, of the 1,400 or so. I'm not doubting that death toll, certainly, but we have seen, in a way, more transparency from the Gaza Health Ministry in the last couple of weeks. But we don't see, we sort of see this reflex not to believe Palestinian sources, not to believe Palestinian officials, to automatically accept, despite the very important historical tenet of journalism, that I.F. Stone said it really well, all governments lie. He didn't say all governments lie all the time, but he did say all governments lie. And there's many examples of that the journalists can point to. But this knee-jerk acceptance of what Israeli officials say, what the IDF says, as the word of truth, when there's a long history of the IDF lying, and also, I mean, Shireen is a very recent example. There are many others. I guess, do you have thoughts on what can tangibly be done about that?
It's hard to
all of you.
Yeah.
it's hard to say, because the only thing that can be tangibly done is to see us as equals. So we are journalists. We happen to be Arab. We happen to be Palestinian. And I hope that you view me as an equal, objective journalist, just like anybody else in the room. The only thing that we can do to solve this problem is to not be racist. That's part of the problem. It's this baked-in racism. And to the point about how you can't mention the word Palestine. I mean, this is AP style guide. We don't refer to the land of the West Bank and Gaza as Palestine. And even though we Palestinians call our homeland Palestine, we don't use that in American newspapers. It's always only in a quote that you'll see the word Palestine or State of Palestine because of the UN.
That's been changing a bit.
But the AP style guide, which most newsrooms
Yeah.
still follow, does not allow the use of the term Palestine to describe the West Bank and Gaza. So when something is being occupied, this is just like the way how insidious the language that we use is, because it seems small, because we all know the occupation, we all know what's being occupied, but we don't actually say the word. And it's weird, because something is being occupied and we're not saying what it is that's being occupied. So what is being occupied? Well, some territories are being occupied, people will say. Some publications will say the occupation of the Palestinian territories. Some publications won't even say Palestinian territories. Some publications will just say the Israeli occupation, leaving the reader with the question of what is the occupation of. Some publications, I believe the Wall Street Journal last year, just referred to it as a conflict among equals, didn't even refer to the word occupation anymore. I don't think that's their official policy, but at least this was an article that I saw. In the New York Times, in their live stream, I also saw them refer to the West Bank as Judea and Samaria, which is the term that settlers use for the West Bank, and that was used as fact, not in quotes, but by one of their reporters in their live stream. And yet we still can't use the word Palestine. Why? I mean, what is it that's being occupied? Yeah. It's our homeland. It's Palestine. And I think we as newsrooms have to keep asking ourselves why we are much more comfortable using the language of the oppressor than the language of the oppressed. Because when we look at history and we see these struggles, we know very well that oppressed people tend to know their struggle more than anybody else, more objectively than anybody else. And oppressed people tend to know their oppressor better than their oppressor knows themselves. It's not to say that you have to take the oppressed's word every time at face value with no skepticism. We're journalists and we will face everybody with the same level of skepticism. But it is the same idea that we have when we talk about sexual harassment, sexual assault in the US, this idea that we have to believe women. It's not to say that every accusation must be believed without due process, but it's to say that women had been silenced in a way around this issue, and that most accusations actually tend to be true, that when somebody makes that accusation, you have to take it with the level of seriousness that it deserves. And so when an oppressed person tells you something, you have to take it with the level of seriousness and objectivity that it deserves. So why do we defer to our own State Department here in the United States and the White House over what terminology to use to describe the occupation, as opposed to pushing back on that language and thinking objectively, what is the best, most truthful, honest way to describe the situation? Since October 7th, I believe most mainstream stories that covered the attack or covered the response to the attack did not include that leading international human rights organizations have accused Israel of being an apartheid regime. Meanwhile, they include that Israel is a democracy. Israel is not a democracy. There's some truth to that statement in that there is some semblance of democracy for Israeli citizens in Israel, but it's not the whole truth, especially not for the millions of Palestinians who live under its jurisdiction without their consent. So that's not truth, but our newsrooms treat that as truth. And yet we completely omit the idea that Israel is an apartheid regime and worse. So I'm not saying that newsrooms now have to adopt apartheid as fact, but I'm just asking for the bare minimum of newsrooms to include that Palestinians accuse Israel of apartheid and have so for decades, that leading international human rights organizations, including Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, accuse Israel of apartheid and have released reports to show that Israel meets the definition under international law of being an apartheid regime. It's not to say that it's the same thing as South Africa, but this is a crime against humanity that Israel is guilty of, and there have been reports to show that this is true. It is fact. Leading Israeli human rights organizations have also said the same thing, and Israeli former politicians have also called their country an apartheid regime. And yet our newsrooms, be they the New York Times or the Washington Post or CNN or MSNBC, don't even care to mention in these stories the important context that Israel is accused of being an apartheid regime. Meanwhile, readers leave stories thinking that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. What truth are we actually spreading when we're talking about this issue? That's the question I have. Why do we keep obfuscating the truth? Truth is uncomfortable. It's always uncomfortable. It's painful. And that's especially true in real time. And we love to pat ourselves on the back when we talk about the civil rights era here in the United States and how we would have been on the right side of history. But truth is painful and it's hard to hear. But we're journalists, and our newsrooms shouldn't be here to placate their readers, to make people feel comfortable. We're not here to be easy to be read. We're not here to be liked. I don't care if you like me. I don't care about any of that. I have family, I have friends who like me, I hope. But we're not here to be liked. We're just here to tell you the truth, however uncomfortable it is, and that's what newsrooms have to be comfortable with. If you get threatened that people will lose or cancel their subscription, so what? That's our job. We're journalists. We're here to tell the truth. And that's what Palestinians have been asking American media to do for so long. And we have not seen that. We didn't see that in 2021. We're not seeing that, especially now. And I think every journalist should be incredibly concerned that they're not actually willing to tell their readers the whole truth of what's happening. And one last point on this. This is why I never get invited to panels, because once, yeah, sorry. It's just that
30 seconds.
literally just 10 seconds. It's just that, actually I lost my train of thought there. So
Okay, I was just saying one last thing. Sorry, one last thing. In response to that. So just literally 10 seconds. At what point, I hear everything you're saying, at what point does it stop being an obfuscation of the truth and just become a lie?
Yeah.
I'm just curious, can we describe some of this as just lies? Anyway.
No, it's true. I mean, sometimes, yeah, I mean, sometimes like the biggest kind of source of misinformation is our mainstream press. Sometimes that happens because we don't actually tell the whole truth. We're worried about what happens on Twitter and what Trump says and all this stuff, but it's oftentimes us not being willing to actually tell our readers the whole truth. And that obfuscation of the truth, for whatever intent it is, I'm not saying there's a nefarious agenda to do this, but the fact that it continues to happen over and over again, that's a huge source of misinformation.
Okay, we're going to move to audio Q&A very soon, but I want to give, I think Deb and Omar had some thoughts.
Sorry.
Possibly.
Here's,
Deb, I saw your hand.
yeah, here's my thought, and it's this. All major media outlets have stringers in Gaza. Everybody does. They were the nameless, faceless person who sent the audio to NPR or a video to whoever. Those people now have faces. And I don't know about you, I listen to the BBC most of the time, and they got a guy in Gaza who's fabulous. He's on every day, and he's really good at what he does. And I think that there's plenty of people now who are being heard from Gaza because everybody now has to depend on them because there's nobody there. And so I'm seeing a lot of journalism out of Gaza done by Palestinians that's very good. So, okay, it's a terrible time for them and they're losing their families. Yes, I watch all of that. I've seen all of that. But that guy got up and he went back out after his family was killed. It was astonishing. But they feel the responsibility to tell the story because they've never gotten to tell it before because they've always been the nameless, faceless person, who gave all the data. So I don't know if that's progress, but that's who I'm getting my news from.
Okay, I'm putting all my questions aside because I promised a half hour. Okay, very quick ground rules. I'm going to keep the mic because you don't have an extra one, and also it's just easier. I'll repeat your question, and we'd like questions, statements you can say for the reception afterwards. It can be, in a two-part question. If you start to do 3, 4 parts, I'm gonna stop you. So raise your hand, and I will call on you. Yes, in the front.
Nice.
Here we go.
How have, for the journalists, sorry, I'm not how have either of you, if you have, raised your concerns in your newsroom? Because that's something I've done since the war started. And like Lena, I'm a lot more open and vocal than I used to be. And I said it out front. This is something that leads to censorship and ruining the careers. And I even told my boss I was scared of losing my job, just so he knows and just so I led with that caveat. But for everything I have said, I haven't said so much more.
Yeah.
So how have you all, done that? And obviously you're maybe in more, esteemed positions. You don't feel concerned about that, but have you been talking very frankly with your colleagues, with your supervisors, with your coworkers, like what are those conversations?
Did everyone hear the question first? Okay.
No.
Mona, take it first.
Okay, you said you didn't hear the question, right? It was like, how are you having conversations with
Oh,
your
they
colleagues?
did
Oh,
hear
okay,
it,
they did.
yeah.
Okay, sorry. Someone shook their head in the back. I saw someone shake their head. The piece, I would give you a piece of advice, if it's okay. I still don't really know what I'm doing. I'm still employed by The Guardian, where I do actually get like a lot of flexibility. What I would say is, I'm not having those conversations face to face because I don't trust the people that I'm having conversations face to face with. I don't trust how my words are going to be used. And I actually think that the thing that is both a dangerous thing to do and also a way to kind of protect yourself is to put everything in writing. So for me, when I said no to this commission, I wrote back and said, I'm a journalist. I will not be considered on the opinion pages to be solely, this is, everything the rant that I just gave you today, I gave in that email. And it's on the record. And it means that they are then faced with a choice very, very clearly in my email with like, would you like me to do my job? Would you like to hire me to do my job of like actual reporting? And if they follow up and say no, then they also have to be held accountable for that because it's black and white. So I would say, as much as you can, put things down in writing.
Paper trail. You're saying
Paper trail, everything, yeah.
Omar and Deb, do you want to talk about that just briefly in the campus context? Because it does, there's
Sure.
it's
Sure.
playing out on campus, including this one.
Yeah, I mean, I think that on campus there has been. I think the other kind of story is what's happening on the campuses because of what happened at Harvard, Columbia, and other places. And what we saw in the beginning is a kind of self-censorship from the presidents of these universities. In the beginning, they came out with some kind of a, just like a worried statement. We're concerned about our students. And then suddenly, a few days later, they come out fully support of Israel and no mention of Muslim students, no mention of Arab students or how this is going to be affecting people in their everyday life. And then there's been a lot of harassment going on. I believe in, at least in my context at Rutgers, what anchors many of us and allow us to be strong with this is the union. So we actually have a union, and despite the union is divided over this issue, actually no one in that union will accept anyone get kicked out just because of expressing their opinion. And the union, we struck last April, we had like a really major kind of event, and that has been a very strong kind of anchor for many of us to be able to organize or say what we want to say or speak to our students very openly. That said, I think there is still a lot of self-censorship or fear from within the kind of the hierarchy of the system. I don't want to be kind of involved in any kind of conflict with anyone. But at the end of the day, I sleep well because I know that there is like a union that will protect me.
So for us, I think at Princeton, we talk about it every week in class. They want to talk about it. There's usually a half-hour break where I said, all right, let's do it. And because they want to talk about the news, they want to know what I think, they want to know, they're afraid, they're nervous. Princeton has put on a ton of webinars and panels and talking, but we've had our own problems. There was a Palestinian professor, a group decided that they'd take a truck and put her picture on it and run around the campus. And that was disturbing, to say the least. They have now sort of backed off and apologized, but not in the same manner as they launched the attack. So Princeton's not a particularly political place, never has been, but you feel it on campus. You really feel it on campus.
There's no such thing as not being political.
Quietly political, let's put it that way.
I think
Silence is-
she means
yeah.
as a center of protest.
Yeah.
As a
No,
camp-
it's not a protest
as
camp.
a
It's not a
center of
protest.
as
Yeah.
Yeah.
opposed to-
Yeah, yes, they are political. They just don't go on the streets.
Okay, I want to see range as well. Okay, how many questions do we have? Okay, Paula, and then I'll repeat Paula, yeah, and I'll repeat your question.
Okay, thank you. This is an amazing panel, and well, and very needed, I think, for many of us who are not journalists, but I study media. But my question is, one thing that wasn't addressed here was and the difference with the coverage vis-a-vis Iraq is the charge of anti-Semitism. And that weighs so heavily in terms of any kind of critical discourse. And we deal with that in the academy. We have to, address, the ugliness of anti-Semitism, but at the same time, figure out safe spaces for conversation. And it's very frustrating, obviously, for, students whose families are affected by this disproportionate violence, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm just wondering about the newsroom and how that question plays out, because I feel like that is a contextual difference worth commenting on.
Okay. Repeat the question or?
Yeah. They can,
Repeat, yeah.
no, they say
Yeah.
repeat it. Yeah,
Okay,
yeah, yeah.
Sorry. Paul's question is about how journalism has dealt with the question of anti-Semitism. which
The
is-
charge of
The charge, sorry.
Accusation.
Okay, accusation of anti-Semitism, which is having a
chilling effect.
chilling effect, especially on campuses. A couple of examples we've talked about, and I think you're getting at what are some better practices possibly that
Just in
journalism
context.
can,
Yeah.
and context that journalism can do. Who wants to take?
I kind of love that it didn't come up tonight, if I'm honest. I really like for me, I think my job as a journalist is to cover, I look at hate crime data. I will look at hate crime data when it comes to anti-Muslim attacks and anti-Jewish attacks, anti-Semitism. Within the context of what we're talking about now, I don't really think it has a place. I don't know. I feel like actually to tie them up together is part of what has held us back so much before in the past. And it's why I really, really appreciate the work of groups like Jewish Voices for Peace.
Right.
Because you know what? You have that conversation. You are going to be far better heard as a white Jewish New Yorker than I ever am in your criticisms of Israel. So go ahead. Yeah.
One thing I would add to this, and it's true, I agree with you on this because I feel like it's not necessarily the truth is every Palestinian I know, including myself, has been charged with being anti-Semitic at some point or another.
Yeah.
It's just our existence has been viewed as a threat to the state of Israel. Therefore, we are a threat to Jews all around the world. That's how people view us sometimes, and we always have to prove that we're not anti-Semitic before somebody takes us seriously.
Where you can't ever prove that. You
Right,
can't
you
ever
can't-
fully
right,
prove that
yeah.
you're,
But I think one of the things that I think newsrooms, one of the most helpful things, this is a small thing, one of the most helpful things that newsrooms can and ought to do is stop citing the Anti-Defamation League as a reliable source of what constitutes anti-Semitism. Because the Anti-Defamation League, which records anti-Semitic hate crimes and then also makes a lot of charges about what actually constitutes anti-Semitism, has a very broad definition of what is defined as anti-Semitism, including criticism of Israel and anti-Zionism. And newsrooms cite the ADL as fact, when in fact it's an advocacy organization that has undermined Palestinians and undermined Israeli critique. So I think when reporters use the Anti-Defamation League, it's not to say that none of their data is reliable or ought to be used, but it's to qualify it not as fact, but as in, define it. There's another thing that oftentimes newspapers or news organizations will refer to anti-Semitic events without actually saying what they were, and then when you dig into it, you realize it was anti-Israel critique. It wasn't actually anti-Semitic critique. So anytime you, as a reporter, refer to a slogan or something that somebody said or a protest as anti-Semitic because you've heard that charge against it, go back and actually make sure that you know what the person said. I'm not saying it's never anti-Semitic. Oftentimes it could be. But don't just say that, there were anti-Semitic protests before actually seeing what the protests were about. So just make sure, that you define your terms. Verify.
Yes.
Do our jobs.
Yeah. Just two things. One is the article in The Atlantic that said anti-Zionism is an anti-Semitism. I don't know if you saw how many times it was retweeted, but it was a lot. And my guess is it's annotated for a lot of people because it was like, whew, okay. Second, read Haaretz. They are amazing in how critical they are, and nobody would dare call them anti-Semitic.
Some people have.
I'm sure they have, but it doesn't land well. It doesn't land well.
Including some
yeah.
journalists here,
Yeah,
not in this room, but
Yeah.
including journalists in our industry have actually called Haaretz an anti-Semitic newspaper, and that it's, it's still, that accusation is levied even against Haaretz.
But it's a bit laughable in this case.
And hard to stick. Yes. So, okay, questions in the back. I see two questions. I'll take them together, way in the very back, and then I'm going to come back to the middle row.
Or you mentioned that, a lot of newsrooms maybe they don't have the various agendas, and so you watch journalists speak the truth. But don't you think it's time that we do address the newsrooms who do have nefarious agendas? Most of them are run by the elite in society and have corporate interests. So by addressing that, we could then start to be a little bit more transparent in what we work with.
Okay. I'm going to take the second question also in the last row. Oh, okay. Okay, we can come back to that comment, but take that question.
So I think I said
Yeah,
that, right?
Abdullah,
Or-
yes. Well,
Was it-
we'll start with Abdullah and
Yeah.
sort of see who else wants to weigh in. So
Can you
How
repeat
do
the
we
question?
address the fact that news organizations are run by elite?
corporate.
Oh, corporate.
Corporate interests.
Yeah.
Yes, and that will have nefarious agendas. And I think, do you want to just define for us, are you talking about kind of like a corporate,
But I do think that, don't you think it's necessary to have that conversation in this context rather than put journalists as, above everybody else, that our only job is actually speaking truth to power, because that's not necessarily the case. And I think that needs to be part of the discourse that we have.
I mean, it's a question about independent media. I mean, independent media today. I think even, I say this, I give this example of now watching the news, switch between, Al Jazeera, Al Mayadeen, all these, because each one of these groups have actually really a very clear agenda in the way they are presenting the news and talking about it. And I think this is like something I probably learned a lot in Lebanon, because you have all these different groups. Each one of them has a TV station, so you kind of really move between the different TV stations to know what's the party line on these events. So I think the issue here is what kind of independent media we're expecting. What is now today is an independent media, because it seems also to me that my very courageous friends here are kind of struggling still with corporate media at the end of the day, and being a free journalist is a constant struggle. So I mean, I'm not a journalist. But I would say that it is really very difficult right now to think about independent media, and that's why you read news against each other and figure out what a lot of these agendas behind, what the corporate agendas or state agendas are behind the narratives.
So maybe a decade ago, I had a fellowship, and I wrote a long paper about the Iraqi media. And one of the things that I discovered, I was able to do a really interesting study about who watched what. And it turned out that Iraqis looked at least 5 channels.
Right.
at least, because they needed to know, is it safe to send my kid to school tomorrow? And it took them 5 or 6 channels to figure it out, because everybody lied. Everybody, not quite a corporate interest, but these were sectarian stations, so they all were broadcasting from their political viewpoint. And at that time, 2010, I thought, Americans don't do that, because we're not threatened in any way, so we don't. You get comfortable with what you're watching, and you watch it every night, and you don't look around. I think now that's not as true as it used to be. Now, certainly I see this with my students, that they're looking at The Guardian, they're looking at Deutsche Welle, they're looking at anything they can find in English, The Guardian, and it's a different way to consume news. They don't look at one source anymore. There's no way that you can take corporate media out of corporate media. That's just the way it works, because it's money that drives this profession. But you can make news into a delicatessen. So you pick a little of this and you pick a little of that, and it's better for you to do it that way.
I would say as well, it's not just a model for readership, but it's also a model for practicing journalism. So I also have worked across various, I've written for the New York Times, the New Yorker, the New York Review of Books, the Guardian, and I think that the advantage of that is that readers, hopefully, if they see my name appear in these different places, they start to get a sense of, like, once you strip away the institution, what is it that you're getting from me as a journalist? What is my stance? And I don't think I'm perfectly objective. I don't think I'm this neutral vessel of information. I think readers, and I've been very, very clear in my journalism of where I stand on certain things, and that is sometimes aligns with these institutions and is sometimes outside of them. And I'm switching where I'm being published accordingly. And I think that's really, really difficult, right? The freelance model is not well paid. I'm frequently asked to write thousands of words for maybe $200. And so I also think if journalists want to eat, unless you all just come from like rich fucking families, which a lot of journalists do, by the way, like it is an elite job. Like a lot of journalists come from money for a reason, because it's hard to make money. I think the model has to change where, like, I think it's just going to become standard for you to like have a job that pays the bills and do journalism on the side, which I think is already happening for a lot of people, which is sad, but anyway.
Okay, I want to try to take Thanasi and Layla. So your hands up. I'm going to take your questions together, and then a question there, and this one in the back. Let's start with these three. Thanasi and Layla.
Thanks for this great panel. I was curious how you all see the historical trajectory of how much protection journalists get. And I'm especially interested in thinking about Omar's work about the erosion of protections for medical personnel, right? So at Geneva Convention's protected class, who are increasingly targeted in war, and I think in this war we've seen the most gross, journalists, medical personnel, aid workers. So I don't believe it's always been this terrible. I think things have gotten worse, and I'm curious how you see that trajectory unfolding or worsening now.
Hi, thanks for doing this. So I have a question regarding editorial versus reporters. Basically, what sort of standards you see that editorial are basically asking for, including language, including framing, versus, let's say, a reporter that might have done an excellent job reporting on a story, and then the story gets editorialized, and their language is shifted, and the headline is added that maybe doesn't match the actual story. And I'm wondering if you have examples of things, like I'm thinking at the top of my head, like when some outlets might say Hamas-run health ministry versus Palestinian Authority health ministry. Are there other examples of things that you've seen discussed between editorial and reporters that they disagree on?
Let's take these two. Omar.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Francis, for this question. I've been kind of trying to figure out how I'm going to talk about healthcare in this panel. So thanks for thanks for that. So yes, I think this is a very important question, because I think one of the things we do as anthropologists, at least maybe how I can differentiate myself from a journalist, is that we kind of linger much longer than the journalists. So in places that we are studying. So a journalist maybe will be related to the event of war. They would come in, they would cover, they would move somewhere else. There's another war, they would be switching. And for someone like me, who's like an anthropologist of war, I kind of have a little bit maybe the privilege to see decades of the same place, and how a place like Iraq, which has gone through 4 or 5 kinds of wars, has transformed. So one of the interesting things about healthcare, and this is a kind of I've been really thinking about this recently because of what's happening in Gaza, is how the hospital has become militarized and weaponized over these past decades of the war on terror. And if you think about it, like we can go back to the 1990s in Iraq and the sanctions, where the entire war was built on starving the hospital and creating a certain kind of disability, affliction for a long time. But of course, it's not a direct attack. This is not really a bombing of the hospital, but a hospital turning into almost like the front line of something like a siege or something like sanctions. And fast forward, you begin to see more and more implications of these healthcare institutions, be it ambulances, be it hospitals, in certain kind of bombing. The Kunduz bombing in Afghanistan, for example. If there is one terrorist there, then they will blow up the hospital. But then still there was like a kind of a backup saying, oh, maybe we'll do an investigation and all of that. In February, I was in Mosul looking at 6 years after the ISIS war. And what really kind of became very clear to me is that all the last battles with ISIS happened in the hospital. The healthcare, the big hospitals were the last battle site. Actually, everyone there will show me the Al-Shifa hospital in Mosul and say, this was the last battle with ISIS. And there's something really very fascinating there with the 9 out of the 13 public big hospitals. They were all destroyed, demolished. All of that was not necessarily brought in. It's like ISIS, like you don't care. Now, what you see in this conflict, one of the most interesting kind of stories is the Al-Quds hospital. No, that was Al-Ahli hospital. Sorry, that it was bombed, and that's the only time where Israel came out and said, no, it wasn't us. That was like Hamas. And then suddenly after that, you begin to see more pushing that line. That line was pushed now. Now it's okay to bomb hospitals, and then there has been kind of continuous attacks on hospitals. My friend and work partner Hassan Abu Sitta, who is in Al-Shifa, today I was speaking with him. He was saying that now I can hear the activities just happening outside. So it is amazing to see how this story of healthcare has been appropriated, normalized. All these attacks on these healthcare institutions are becoming more and more the norm rather than the exception. So I'm definitely worried, and I'm worried about this not only because it's just an attack on a hospital and the legality of this. These are global health, public health disasters waiting to happen. The way we think about war as an event is within a temporal kind of limit is one thing, but thinking about it as a process, as a long-term process. What you see in a place like Mosul 6 years after the ISIS war, after the destruction of the entire healthcare system, is the rise of these all kinds of epidemics are spreading with people moving from one place to the other. So I think what the fear here is what is this the aftermath, the afterlife of this war, and where things are going. And when healthcare is completely demolished, then what kind of response are you gonna have for the future? So this is where I feel the gravity of this is more in the waiting and seeing what's going to happen even after that, and the catastrophes that will come out of this.
Omar, so I'm going to ask you very quick, if you can give us 30 seconds. My rudimentary understanding of international law is that even if, for example, thinking of the Israeli argument that Hamas has bases under Al-Shifa, I guess, and other hospitals. So even if that were true, even if the aggressor party can prove that, it actually doesn't absolve them under
because there is a protection for the injured. When you're dealing with an injured body of the enemy, there needs to be kind of a protection of that injured to be taken care of, or to be rehabilitated or whatever. But I think with and I think this is where the link is with with the war on terror, because that category, the terror category, has allowed anything to happen. It is just basically you need to eradicate it. It's an idea, you know. It's not just an enemy fighting you a fair battle or whatever kind of battle. It's something that needs to be derooted. And we see this attacks and this appropriation of hitting injured people, or hitting a place and then hitting it once again when the rescuers come in. The double tapping strategy of the U.S. military. These were all developed and cooked in the laboratory of the war on terror. So I think Israel has done everything it can to reiterate the same tropes of the war on terror. This is a ISIS-like group. ISIS came from so many different places and came. This is a group. This is a group that was is from there. So there's all these tropes about the war on terror that became so central to the Israeli kind of discourse about the war and how it's waging that war.
Sorry, Coach.
Yes,
Just
quickly amend that.
this idea of it
Do in a
being
minute.
also an attack on an idea. This is such a ridiculous way to start a sentence. In addition to it being a human rights abuse, that should be absolutely sufficient. There is also something about attacking a hospital, which almost feels like, I'm like formulating this as I'm saying it, maybe it's problematic. It feels like a little bit of an attack on Arab identity, because medicine was like the fucking jewel in our crown. Iraqi's medical infrastructure, the level of medical knowledge and not just in Iraq, across the region, is also something that we prided ourselves on. My parents were both doctors who were literally welcomed with open, not quite welcomed with open arms, but were really, really received in the UK where doctors were needed, because it was understood that the Iraqi standard of medicine was phenomenal. I don't know, there's something about attacking on a hospital. I think I'm also reflecting right now on how deeply my own internalized racism was especially aggravated by the war in Iraq and this deep shame to be Iraqi, and actually maybe something that I've never felt more pride to be Arab than I do right now, which I guess is good. Yeah.
I just want to say one short thing, and that is, too bad there's not a 9/11 or a 911 you can call for international crimes. Ask the Syrians and ask the Ukrainians. I mean, hospitals were bombed in Syria for 10 years, and nobody came out on the street for that. Ukraine has been hit repeatedly. I mean, the Syrian case was much worse because all medicine was criminalized. Anybody who treated a protester or, I don't even know what you call them, those who were against Assad, that was all criminalized. The regime took medical supplies off UN trucks, and nobody said very much about that. Ukraine, the same thing. And here's the problem. We have no accountability. We live in an age of impunity. And when people can do anything, they will do everything. And we've been living that for the last 20 years. And so this is just another iteration of there is no accountability.
And I think with the Syrian regime, they still also use that war on terror narrative.
Yes,
like
they
for
do.
them, these were terrorists doing kind of work in these hospitals. And in many ways, it is that the war on terror really kind of blurred that line between warfare and healthcare. And I think that is very interesting, because you see it not only happening from the West in Iraq and in Afghanistan, but you see it being adapted by Arab regimes and by authoritarian kind of dictatorships to say, well, these guys, the West is doing that. They're fighting terror. We're also fighting terror. So it is really this appropriation, because it's a war with no rules.
With no rules.
And I think that is really what we learned from all this impunity.
Okay, I know there are lots of questions. We didn't get to the last question. We have to do the award ceremony part. So that'll take us about 20 minutes, and then we'll have the reception. And those of you who have questions, come to us afterwards. We have to switch out now and sit there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Do we move?
I great. And I was like, is he agreeing with me or disagreeing with me? I don't know.
That's funny. I was laughing because
My
that's
mom
what my
studied
whole
in
argument
Mosul.
is.
She studied in Mosul.
Seriously?
Yeah. She went in